Hello today. We're going to be talking about economic growth. Um, Kind of brief notes again. Most certainly, your module and the text are really critical for you to look at. Economic growth is something that's relatively recent. Um, Pretty much for 1,500 years, from at least the time of Christ and start of AD. But we didn't see much economic growth, and at least in the Western world. We most certainly saw some in other parts of the world, such as China and India, but the Western world we did not. Times of prosperity were times when maybe we were after a plague and there was a little bit more land per person. But in terms of generally just a growth pattern where things got better, we just didn't see that. But most certainly over the last 300 years, we have. England was a starting point for it. And some people argue that that was because England was more open to a change in the way we think about how we relate to other people. In other words, capitalism wasn't a natural thing, it was something that had to be learned. And Great Britain was a learning ground for that particular area. And then other countries started to learn from Great Britain. Most certainly, what we did, we saw US pretty much what Great Britain did is double their GDP in 58 years. The United States actually did it in 47 after the Civil War. Japan did it in 34 years, starting in 1885. It occurred much faster in Germany. It occurred so quickly in Germany that it caused economic stagnation. Well, not economic stagnation, caused political instability as the country went from about 20% urban to about 80% urban in about 20 years. China most certainly has been growing at a doubling it every 10 years, South Korea in about every 11 years. So most certainly we're seeing a major changes occur, and it seems to be speeding up. What are the major milestones in this economic growth pattern? Well, the Industrial Revolution, starting in the 1700s, mid 1700s. That was in Europe, starting in Great Britain, of course. Then the next really big one was probably the Information Age. And there's other minor ones, such as the Fordian Revolution, named after Henry Ford and his mass production techniques and assembly lines. But generally, the next really big one is the Information Revolution. And we entered the information economy somewhere between the late 50s and the early 70s, depending upon how you count information workers. If you include information workers as being people like doctors and highly skilled people, we probably entered earlier than later. But it's most certainly a change, and most people nowadays make their living by being informed, spreading information, using information, not by actually doing anything that's hard and physical. So what we're looking at, of course, is growth is an increase in productivity. And what is productivity? Productivity is the increase of any kind of material, resource, good, service, whatever, that you can do with reduced amounts of inputs. So if you can basically produce something in 1950 for the equivalent of $10 worth of resources a day, but by now you've gone down to maybe $3 for resources. Well, then obviously you've increased productivity. And much of this productivity increase comes from, of course, technology and spreading of information and automation. I can't even imagine going back to the time where you had checkers who actually had to know the prices on all the goods in a grocery store and actually enter them by hand in a cash register. They were highly skilled people, and they're now obsolete because we scan everything. Now, it's a loss of a good job, but most certainly for most of us and for businesses, a huge savings in costs, and that allows for a reduction in the cost of items that we purchase. The US has historically been the highest in productivity recently, but the growth rate has varied, and we may not be any more. We have had different times of sustained growth. Most certainly the highest was peacetime, And that was between 1946 and 1968. By the way, just so you know, the tax rate during most of that period of time, maximum individual tax rate was 92%. And in the last part of it, it was 70%. Well, certainly suggesting the taxes were a real problem. From 68 to 92, growth was average to poor. The Reagan period, was some conservatives like to call a glorious period, really wasn't, the growth wasn't real high and unemployment wasn't real low. This wasn't necessarily the fault of the president, but most certainly it was not the picture of rosy growth and, prosperity that many of us like to have a vision for that. The United States continues to be one of the most productive, but per worker, but that's a little misleading. Americans work about 2,000 hours per year. That's 2,000 hours per year. Europeans, on average, work only about 1,700 hours per year. Now, 300 hours is 7+ weeks of time off. That'd be pretty nice to have some of that kind of time off rather than having to work all the time. But most certainly, it's even more so in some countries. Some countries have as little as 1,400 hours of work, which is equivalent of almost 3 months. Why isn't the United States, therefore, growing faster? Why aren't we doing better? Why are other countries catching up and possibly doing as well or possibly a lot better than us? And I most certainly think that is potentially the case. We worry about that a lot, but it's a practical issue too. Well, there's a variety of reasons. One, we're not very good at saving. In China, they save almost 45, 50% of their income, and they invest it. I have to admit, a lot of that's wasted and not done well because the state invests it and have done a very good job. But we at times invested as low as 1%, 2% of what we earned. And sometimes it's been negative even, or we've actually spent more than we earned. We have a declining educational system. That's my phone telling me somebody's at the front door. We have a declining educational system. At one time, we led the world. We had 3 college graduates to every one for the best, second best country. We are now 8th in the world. In 1996, we were graduating, very, very few highly technical people in comparison to some other countries, and we aren't doing any better now. We're not graduating anymore. I mean, so the percentage of our population keeps dropping off. And we can blame it for a variety of reasons. We can say maybe Americans are lazy or something else. I don't know. I don't know what it is. I do know we still win Nobel Prizes, but disproportionately, Americans that win Nobel Prizes are American immigrants. They came here and then do very, very well. Long-term energy costs can be a problem if we don't address it. We could. Most certainly, we have the technology now to address it. And we are doing better than we used to do. The future is not in fossil fuels. We have to address that now. People say, well, that's a big cost. And what about all the investment in gasoline and all this kind of stuff? Well, those are good for transition. But the reality is, when they're obsolete, they're obsolete. And we're going to have to look for something else. Environmental safety regulations. Some people say, well, those kill jobs. The reality is probably don't. As you address those problems, you improve efficiency. I can remember back in the 1950s when we started trying to do, early 60s, smoke control in cars. At first, the technology was terrible. I'd do it to existing cars and they would they'd be terrible. They get poor gas mileage. But what happened is because of environmental controls, companies like Honda came up with more efficient engines. And it turns out that we got better performance at the same time we got less environmental problems. I think that's probably going to be the case with most of them. Most certainly, it doesn't look to be a real issue. We have a very expensive and ineffective healthcare system. It's terrible. There's a section on healthcare and a lecture I have on healthcare. Our system just doesn't work very well. We waste $101.5 trillion every year in a healthcare system, just wasted because it just doesn't work right. And we get a very poor result for it. We also have terrible infrastructure, bridges, schools, highways, dams. Our infrastructure in terms of internet, electrical carriage, systems for turning things back and forth, they're just in poor shape. The American Society of Civil Engineers rates us a D. I understand it's a solid D right now, but just a D. Other countries do very much better. And then, of course, we spend a lot of money on military. Now, I can't tell you that we shouldn't spend money in military. It's a pretty complex issue. But like it or not, it still is $800 billion a year. They could go to more productive types of things, including education, our infrastructure. We may just have to find a way around it, possibly by changing our healthcare system to get more out of it. So what are we doing well in? I mean, most certainly we don't seem like we're doing great. We are cutting off immigration, which is also one of the factors that's really been beneficial to our economic growth, because we're an aging population and it's gotten more so every year. But what do we do well in? Well, we do well in marketing and retailing. That's not insignificant. These are major services. Other countries are copying our techniques. So it is important to recognize these are important things. Much of the expense of buying something comes from being able to market it and retail it efficiently. We also do very well in information services. We are one of the best in the world, if not the best. Well, certainly in research, we're the best. We may not be as good at producing some of the electronic stuff, but for developing new stuff and doing some of the really complicated stuff, we're still number one. Some of that's driven by that military spending I talked about too. But we are very good. We're very good in consulting services, including legal services. Again, don't look down on the legal part. One of the reasons the American economy functions well is we have a well-developed contract law. We know how to work very well with it. These are things that are important, and we have a positive export trade on that even. Overall, though, the United States is not doing well. We could do vastly better. But we aren't going to do better by sticking our head in the sand and pretending that we're already the best. We're not going to do better unless we are willing to adjust to the modern world and the fact that other countries are adjusting to the modern world. Simply cutting off trade to other countries would be damaging. It'd drive up costs, leave us isolated, both politically and economically, and would probably slow economic growth. Wouldn't create many jobs, we'd lose a lot of jobs. But being more productive so that we can produce and export things to other countries, that makes a lot of sense. So what we have to do is try to find ways to do that type of thing, not engage in trade wars, not engage in blaming immigrants or foreign workers, recognizing that automation is going to continue and you have to adjust to it, improving our educational system and our infrastructure to be able to compete effectively. I will talk to you again very soon. I hope that all is going well for you in this class. Goodbye.